Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name's Benito. I'm a PhD student in biology at the University of Bristol. Now, my second most popular video on YouTube at the moment is this one where I talk about how to apply for a PhD, which I made about a year ago, just before I started my PhD. So I thought, what better time than now to give a bit of an update on that. So I took to my Instagram stories the other day, asking for questions from you guys on what PhD life is like. And luckily, you submitted some, so in true YouTube Q&A style, it's time to go through them. Here goes!
It's so exciting.
Now, I'm going to start off with what seems like a simple question, but I actually think it's a very important question to answer, because I'm not even sure that I knew how to answer this question until quite late on in my academic career. Really general, so sorry if it doesn't make sense, but how does research work? The thing is, when you finish your A-levels, you're kind of taught the idea that we pretty much know everything there is to know about the natural world, and really that's completely not the case. As you go through an undergraduate biology degree, you realise that there are so many gaps in our knowledge, even now in the 21st century, and that is what research is all about. And the exciting thing is that it never ends, because as soon as you answer one question, that opens up a whole plethora of different other questions. So there's always stuff to explore. And that's essentially what research is all about. It's about finding a hypothesis which has never been tested before, testing it either in the lab or in the field or whatever, and then writing up those results into a manuscript, which hopefully should eventually get published. And once it's published, that means it's now knowledge within the scientific community and can then be cited and then used by other scientists so they can generate their own hypotheses. So that, in a nutshell, is what research is like. But essentially, that's what a PhD is as well, because the whole aim of a PhD is to create new knowledge, and that's what makes doing research and PhDs and postgraduate degrees all the more exciting. And also, if your research has a wider impact on society, then once your work is published, then you may have the opportunity to speak to policymakers and actually create change. Do PhDs focus on one very specific area? Great question. Yes, they do. They tend to. So when I applied for my PhD, I applied for this specific project, which might seem quite specific. I mean, I'm studying butterflies' brains. It doesn't get more niche than that, does it really? But one thing that people have got to get their head around in biology is that when we're studying something like butterflies' brains, we're not just finding out stuff about butterflies' brains. Rather, we're using these butterflies as a model to understanding something a lot more broad about how biology works, how evolution works, and in my case, how senses evolve. So even though I am quite interested in the butterflies themselves, actually, just by studying these butterflies, they're telling me an awful lot about other organisms as well. So when I'm doing my literature searches, for example, I'm looking at papers about geckos, about fishes, about stick insects, because ultimately the whole tree of life is interlinked. So what's going on in one species can tell us an awful lot about what's going on in another. So part of the challenge of biology, I think, is finding the perfect model organism. And also on a similar note, when you start a PhD, there's a lot of scope for you to tailor it towards your interest. I mean, obviously I applied to this specific project because I was interested in it, but even though it seems quite niche from the get-go, there are actually multiple avenues in which you can go down with the project I'm doing. So I do have a lot of freedom in that sense to tailor the project to my specific interests and passions. Another great question here: how many marks do we need in our masters to apply for a PhD? Well, so obviously the sad story is that applying for funded PhDs is extremely competitive. So the better grades you have, the better. This is one of the few kind of application processes where grades really do matter above everything else, I'm afraid. So if you're in your undergraduate degree at the moment and you really want to do a PhD, then really try and work hard and get that first class degree. Usually the requirements on the application forms are a 2-1 and above, but realistically, if loads of people with firsts are applying to the same PhDs as you, especially if they're part of these competitively funded DTPs, then they're going to have priority, I'm afraid. If you don't know what I mean when I say competitively funded DTPs, make sure you check out my video on how to apply for PhDs, because I explain all about that there. In terms of how many marks you need in your masters, well, I actually think just having a masters to start with is what puts you in a really, really good position. For me personally, I did a masters by research, and the outcome of that was either a pass or a fail. Well, you could pass with no corrections, minor corrections, and major corrections, etc. But on your certificate, it was just either pass or fail. So, that didn't really make much of a difference to me. But if you doing a taught masters or something like that where it is graded, then obviously try and aim for the highest grade possible. But it's not always like that though. If you're applying to a project where the funding is already secured and all you have to do is to convince the supervisor that you're qualified, then sometimes things like work experience really becomes really important as well. Other things to consider when you're applying for UK-funded PhDs are things like awards. If you've got any awards of academic achievement, make sure you put them on your CV, and also any research publications. Now, I didn't have any of these, actually. I didn't have any awards or publications when I was applying for my PhD. And I think to have a publication out before your PhD, then you've got really lucky, to be honest with you. That's great. But if I knew that having a publication was going to be important in the application process, then maybe when I was doing my final year undergraduate project, for example, I would have asked my supervisor at the time whether there was any possibility of publishing, because then maybe I would have got somewhere with that. But really, at the time, as a naive undergraduate, that really wasn't on the top of my list. But if you are a naive undergraduate and want to do a PhD, then maybe bear that in mind when you're writing your final year dissertation or something like that. And on a similar note, how much more intense is your PhD from your masters? Interesting question. As I said before, I did a research master's, which was basically like a mini PhD. On balance, I would say the PhD is a bit more intense, but I think the primary driver for the increase in intensity when you're doing a PhD is ultimately money, to be honest, because when you're doing a PhD, you're funded, you're being paid to do what you do, which means you kind of treat it as a 9-to-5 job. Certainly before COVID, I was getting into the office at 9 and then leaving at 5 and then making a strict point to not work at the weekends. Because, ultimately, my research is funded by the taxpayer, and you kind of don't want to let them down, do you? And linking up perfectly with that question is this one. Are they as stressful and anti-work-life balance as people say? Now, I think this one is actually quite difficult for me to answer at this point, because I'm only now in the second year of my PhD. So what I'm about to say now, I might be disagreeing with in a couple of years' time, where I'm frantically trying to finish. But ultimately, I think I'm doing all right in terms of work-life balance. As I say, as long as you treat it as a kind of 9-to-5 job, you take a step back at the weekends and relax and do other things and clear your head, then I think you can still have a life and do a PhD. I don't feel that impacted socially, which seems kind of weird saying that, seeing as though I'm currently in a room by myself speaking to a camera. Ultimately, it's about being organised, and I think if there is a day where, I need to stay in the office for an extra couple of hours in the evening, or I need to work at the weekend, I'm personally not too bothered by that when that needs to happen, because ultimately, I love what we do, and people do PhDs because they're passionate about the subject that they're researching. So, and I think that's quite a special thing. So I don't see a problem with the work-life balance yet. Oh God, I hope that doesn't come back to haunt me. And linking on to that question, we've got how much spare time do you have around doing a PhD? And are you full or part-time? Well, the answer to the second question is that I'm full-time. In general, it's a lot harder to get funding for a PhD when you're part-time, in my experience. But I've got no problem with being full-time. I'm not really doing anything else with my life apart from creating silly videos like this. So as I said before, the work-life balance is absolutely fine. I don't work at the weekends. I focus on seeing my friends, making YouTube videos like this, and watching Pointless. Right, really quickly, a very specific question about my research. Why not British species? Well, that kind of ties on to what I was saying earlier about model organisms. So the reason why I'm studying the butterflies I'm studying is because they've got fascinating ecologies, they've got fascinating behaviours, they've got fascinating mimicry patterns, and it's the interaction between all those things which has led me to study these butterflies in order to answer really broad biological questions. So, in short, these butterflies are just a little bit cooler than British ones. Sorry. I know it may seem sometimes that scientists choose exciting animals just to give them an excuse to jet to exciting parts of the world. But think of the people looking at Drosophila. I don't think they're doing it for those reasons. Although I have to say, the sooner you get me to the Ecuadorian rainforest, as soon as this pandemic malarkey is over, the better. Goodness me, possibly the hardest question so far now. What is better? Pointless trophy or PhD? Gotta be pointless trophy, hasn't it? Do you find doing research lonely at all, or is it usually fairly social before COVID? That's also a really interesting question. I think it really depends on whether you're part of a cohort or not. And by that, I basically mean whether you started your PhD in September. Because if you start at the time when everyone else is starting, at least you're more likely to meet other people starting a PhD at the same time as you. Now, I must say, I kind of had the upper hand in this situation because obviously I did my undergraduate degree and master's degree in Bristol as well. So I kind of knew the ropes a little bit. But I think those first few weeks in September last year are really, really helpful for my other colleagues that were new to the city to meet people. And also, it's very helpful in Bristol because all the first year PhD students are put in the same office. So that meant we could all really gel quite nicely. But even if you start a PhD not in September, there's always opportunities to meet people. The first point of contact, of course, is your lab group. The other people in your research group that have the same supervisor as you. And that's actually one thing which I didn't talk about in my application to a PhD video, but it's advice that I would definitely give now. When you're applying for a PhD, obviously, who the supervisor is very important and whether you get on with them. But also, the lab group is another thing to consider. Try and get a feel for how social it is and how friendly it is. Luckily, mine's really, really friendly, but it's not something which I really considered before applying to do the PhD. So that's another little point to consider. And then, of course, when you're at university, there's all sorts of clubs and societies which you can join as well. So as long as you're proactive about it and you reach out to people, then you shouldn't feel lonely. In terms of the research itself, I certainly haven't felt that lonely. As I say, I've got a very collaborative research group. A lot of the stuff that I've learned wasn't actually taught to me by my supervisor. It was taught by other people in the research group, the postdocs and the fellow PhD students, etc. So it's that kind of sharing of knowledge which creates a sense of community. But having said that, I see my supervisor every week to catch up both academically and personally as well. So I definitely feel like I'm part of a community rather than just working on my own. Obviously, compared to undergrad, it is slightly less wild, but thank goodness for that. And final question. Academia isn't a true and fair benchmark. It's very standardized. What's your balanced view on this? Now, that is an interesting question. It's a very deep and thought-provoking question as well. And I'm not sure whether I'm in completely the right position to answer it. Ultimately, the way that academia works isn't very standardized, which is weird because it feels like it should. Because as I was saying earlier, the most important thing in doing well in academia is just how good your research is, how many publications you have. So that ultimately narrows down to how good you are academically as an individual. At least it should be a pretty good reflection of it. But yet, if you look at the range of academics in my department, for example, you don't see an awful lot of diversity. There's definitely a heavy male bias. But maybe, of course, that maybe stems something from below the university level, the overall education system, and people from disadvantaged backgrounds aren't as encouraged to apply for university. Because I think once you reach undergraduate level, once you're fortunate enough to get onto an undergraduate degree program, then it really does become more of a level playing field, because the people who do well at university are the people who really, really work hard, and everyone has the same level of resources available to them, more or less. So when it comes to applying for postgraduate degrees, the people who do well are the ones that have succeeded academically, and they're the ones that have really worked hard in their undergraduate degree, regardless of privilege. But of course, there is a lot more to it than that. Especially after all the things that have gone on right now this year in 2020, I do have hope that things are steadily moving in the right direction towards equality. For example, there are specific grants you can apply to now where women or BAME applicants are specifically encouraged to apply. So that's hopefully helping to balance things out in the academic community. But yeah, still an awful lot of work to be done for sure, and not something which I've really been able to give a succinct answer to before. But thank you for answering the question, because it's made me think about it. Anyway, I think that's enough for one day. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. It was a really nice broad range of questions there, so hopefully it's helped you out. If you've got any other questions, put them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe down below and hit the notification bell as well, so you can keep updated on all my wildlife and science adventures. Autumn and winter's a pretty awkward time to be doing wildlife and science videos as an entomologist in particular, because there isn't as much around, but I'll try and do more videos out and about looking for nature in the upcoming future as well. And of course, you can follow me on social media. The links are in the description bar below this video. It'd be lovely to get connected. In the meantime, stay safe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Goodbye!
Let's get scratching.